Welcome to the EO Podcast with Bret Keisling, part of the EO Podcast Network.
Hello, my friends. Thank you for listening. Welcome to part 2 of my conversation with Campbell McDonald, who's the Chief Executive at Ownership at Work, a charitable think tank based in the United Kingdom. Part 1 of the conversation, which is episode 281, can be found on our website at www.esoppodcast.com. It's not strictly necessary that you listen to part 1 before listening to this episode, but in this case I do recommend it. You'll learn about Campbell and his work, and it may put some of the things we talk about in this episode in context. As I mentioned at the start of part 1, there were a couple of glitches in the audio that couldn't be fixed in editing, but overall I hope you'll agree that for a transatlantic Zoom call, the audio is really good. Without further ado, here's part 2 of my conversation with Campbell McDonald. I want to go back to the point that you made because I think it was absolutely wonderful, and it is something that does come up on the podcast from time to time, depending on the guest. Taking the US EsOp as the example here, but I want to apply the point to all forms of employee ownership. If you take the fact that ESOPs are required by law to send annual statements to all of the employee owners, if you take that out of the equation, so the annual meetings that we recommend and having your trustees and third-party administrators come and speak to the employees, if you take that out, everything else that an employee-owned business does is just good business. It is just a good business practice. It is the best practices, as we say. And to that extent, if there was no such thing as employee ownership, my podcast could perhaps have been done just in terms of this is a way to create more fulfilling jobs. But then you add into it that equity piece, and you take all of these very positive things that would make our world a better place if more businesses instituted them and say, hey, you're going to get a share of the profits, or you're going to get a share of the ownership, et cetera, et cetera. You're absolutely right. It's just good business, and I celebrate it. I'm delighted with that.
I agree with you, but there's a critical point in here. And the sort of simple version of it is if the role, the ability of employees as owners to have influence on the way decisions are made in a business, if that influence is real and the business chooses to, because running a business, we know, right? You're squeezing a balloon, right? You can't afford everything. You can't do everything. You've got to make trade-offs. You've got to make choices. And if, because it's employee owned, the business chooses to focus on profit maximization, let's say, at the expense of expenditure on other things, then the profit that the employees take home is the owner benefit that they have prioritized. If it chooses, because it's listening to its employee owners, its shareholders, to spend more money on achieving its environmental footprint or looking after employee well-being, then it's doing that because it's employee owned. It's doing it to the level it's doing it because it's employee. So I hear your point. I hear that point, kind of some of this stuff is just good business. And I've had that challenge for, years and years, oh, you don't have to be employee owned to do all this stuff. Well, you're right. You don't. But the point is, if you joined a business and it was doing that on day one, and 3 years in, leadership changed and all those things disappeared, in most businesses, there's nothing you can do about that. You just got to leave and go find a different employer. If you're an employee-owned business, then you have an opportunity to influence whether that happens or not. You have trustees potentially, or you have some say somewhere in who is appointed. What is the kind of person that you want running the business? What is the kind of strategy that you're pursuing? That's the difference. That's what's powerful for me.
I think that you're right. And I think to some extent, my comments might have swerved a little bit from what I intended. Employee ownership is absolutely the secret sauce that drives, in my mind, all of these best practices that I had talked about. The point that I was looking for was these are not oftentimes what we talk about. The hallmarks of a good employee ownership company are not exotic, mysterious practices that, the secret cabal of employee owners, conjure up, that they're just solid business things, but absolutely, to your point, driven by the fact that they are employee-owned companies. That's steeped in the why and the how.
So wait, well, Brett, let me ask you a question. I hope that's not controversial. Sorry, but how good do you think the board, the average board of a US employee-owned business, how good do you think they are at delivering the benefits of ownership to their employees, at understanding their role in doing that?
That you asked the question is not controversial. That I may step my foot into it with my answer, perhaps, is a different story. There are a couple of things, Campbell, and I don't want to tee off on my own rant here. First of all, we have, last number I saw was 6,300, 6,400 ESOPs in the United States. And I'll talk about the ESOPs because I am more familiar with them. I think trusts at this point still number in the dozens, maybe 100, 150 in the US. Worker co-ops, less than 1,000, I believe. Of the 6,300 or so ESOPs, maybe 1,000 of them participate in our employee-owned organizations. So the ESOPs that I talk about on the podcast, if they've come to my attention, tend to be the creme de la creme that is instituting and executing best practices in so many different areas. I believe that the vast majority of ESOPs, or certainly the majority of ESOPs, have no contact with the employee ownership community, and therefore I don't have any reason to think that they are any more engaged other than those legal requirements that I talked about. They will send an annual statement to the employees. I think that boards in general, specifically to your question, we have two challenges in the US with boards. First of all, if you are transitioning from a single shareholder or a couple of shareholders who are business partners or family members, it is quite possible that you are transitioning to employee ownership without really having a functioning board in the first place. You know, for a privately held company, your board meetings can really consist of your attorney writing down on this date and date, such and such, the board met and did X and X, and there wasn't really a meeting, and that's absolutely fine. So part of the education in the transaction to initiate the transition is to explain the board function for just having a qualified board for the company. So oftentimes, first of all, it is no longer controversial, but I was an ESOP trustee from 2012 to 2019, and it was probably 2017 or so before we started requiring outside directors, independent board members, as part of the transaction. And there would just be like, hey, if you got a board of 5, 6, or 7, we want one to be independent. There was a great buildup of education on what the board should do. So I think that there are plenty of companies that do a great job, and they have been on the podcast, and their board is very engaged, and the board gets it. But I think, you know, you would use the phrase where you and I in this conversation and all my podcasts are kind of preaching to the choir. I think that's often the case. The vast majority of the boards, I think, probably do a very poor job.
And look, my question isn't loaded in the sense that I want to gripe against, you know, I know that's not what you were doing either, but I want to gripe against people running businesses, right? I've run a business. It's insanely hard work, particularly a smaller business. And, you know, so, but what I'm observing in the UK is that where a transaction has taken place, a majority shareholding has been sold, for instance, to a trust, and that the payment for that may be spread over a number of years, but the owner has exited, perhaps, but there is some version of a leadership team now running an employee-owned business. And there's almost a sort of, you know, for some, a kind of help, you know, we've been sold to an EOT. Like, you know, like what, nobody told us, there isn't a textbook on this, right? Nobody told us what that means. Maybe a set of expectations have been set in the minds of employees at the point where they were told about it. And then no one around that board has experience of working in an employee-owned business. And I'm not saying it's huge or vastly different, but there is a fundamental point here which is different. And if you allow me literally 2 minutes, the EO model in the UK has been sold for 30 years off the back of a set of benefits. And the script for that typically goes something along the lines of, it's going to be brilliant. Everybody's going to be super motivated by this. You're going to unlock this fantastic, you know, explosion of discretionary effort. You're going to change people's attitudes and behaviors. You're going to see people more conscious of money that's spent in the name of the business. People are going to be producing ideas about how the business can do better because they understand the link between them and profit. You're going to see your top line go up. You're going to see absenteeism go down. It's going to be easier to recruit and retain good people. You're going to see your bottom line go up as well. Therefore, you're going to have this fundamentally more resilient business, and everyone is going to be happy and skipping to work every morning, right? That's some version of that, right? And of course, that's just, right? It's just what it sounds like. It's a fairy tale. Right. No, if you have a day a year where your business feels like that, amazing, right? Like that's just not human nature. That's not how these wonderful, crazy, organic things work. But I have seen businesses who have many more than one day a year that feels like that, right? And they associate it with this model. But the point is, for an individual in that business, that's not how you think about ownership. So I understand why the model's been sold like that, because it's sold to existing owners, and quite often they're founder owners, and they're people who've been running the business. So they think in terms of what's the benefit for the business. I've even seen owners who are announcing this to their employees say to rooms full of colleagues, and you're going to become way more motivated, and that's going to help the business succeed. And you see people sitting there going, I don't think that's how motivation works. I think you tell me I'm going to become more motivated, right? Like that.
Or else.
Right. And there's a fundamental point here, though, right? Which is, and I am always amazed by how many well-run businesses with grown-up boards who make data-driven decisions still don't see this necessarily, right? I've sat around numerous board tables where quite often an FD for some reason is sort of saying, well, we've been in this model for 2 years now, or we've been in this model for 4 years now, and people are not acting like owners. And I don't, why are they not doing their bit? Why aren't they? And I typically have to sort of stop and pause and say, well, hey, hang on a minute. When was the last time you asked your owners what were the benefits that they got from being owners? When was the last time you gave them a list? Because they don't think of those benefits. They think, do I get more cash in my bank account? Do I like it when I come into work? Do I have roles and opportunities to do things that I wouldn't do elsewhere? Do I get more autonomy in my job, which I wouldn't get working at a place down the road, a factory down the road? Do I have voice? Therefore, am I listened to? Does the business do more? The pandemic is a perfect example. The disproportionate amount of focus on supporting post-pandemic, so health and well-being or cost of living crisis in the UK over the last 2 or 3 years, from EO businesses to non-EO businesses. Does my business look after me? Does it invest in me? Those are the benefits that I think of as an individual employee. But so many boards, so many leadership teams don't talk about employee ownership in terms of, this is how we are returning a benefit to you of being an owner in this business. I mean, I typically try to say to them, so we talk about B Corps and kind of, in the world of social and environmental impact measurement, they've borrowed this idea of materiality, right, from accountancy. So what's relevant, what's important? So I try to get all the EO businesses that I work with to say, well, why don't we do a materiality test with our owners? Why don't we give them that list? And why don't we say to them, which of these matter to you? And then rank the 2 that are most important. Because then when you're a board and you're making a choice, rather than going, we'll give them some share of profit, whatever we happen to decide is available at the end of the year, that's good enough. Actually, you've got some information that says, well, we know what our owners are prioritizing. And when you talk to them, you go back to them, you go, well, you told us this was most important. This is what the business has done. This is our return to you as owners. Realizing benefits for people in that way, in that very explicit way, it's straightforward. Most good, well-run businesses are doing this anyway, but they're not framing that stuff as, look, we're prioritizing this because as owners, you've told us it's important. They're just like, well, this is what we do. And they're missing a trick, right? Because you should be using to reinforce with your owners, because look, the maths is so simple. You do not switch on any of those firm level benefits, those business level benefits, unless enough individuals are super excited about being owners in your business and feel motivated and so on. And unless that math works, you're not going to see those benefits. Those FDs are right. They're not seeing them come through. So, it's a really critical point to me, this, about kind of, are boards aware of, doing justice to what many businesses are already doing in order to activate that motivational driver, that ownership model, so that it delivers the kind of performance that we believe.
I am always surprised when I meet a member of the board of directors and find that particular company's board has never met the actual employees. Ivory Tower might be a little too mean-spirited, perhaps, but they're meeting out of sight of the employees. And it also tied in, to my mind, and I think it starts with board and upper management. There are so many components that go into the culture of any business. And to effect change in a culture is really hard and takes a lot of work. But for example, I don't know how big of a theme in the UK open book management is, but here there's an understanding that you need some sort of financial literacy at whatever baseline, because, and I loved your EO aha moment. I loved as we had discussed earlier, the JLP sign that talked about the lights. But to me, the financial management, everybody knows from growing up, turn off the lights before you leave. We're not heating the neighborhood, is what stereotypically all of our parents were rumored to have said back then. But does an employee owner understand the cost to the business of misshipping an order to a customer? Do they understand the ramifications of how their tasks are done, and not just the ramifications, but the benefits of a task well done? And I think that's part of the interplay that's often missed between the board and the employee owners.
So look, I think you're 100% right. So the last bit, if you like, for me of this, of how you do this, is what I would call final mile behaviors. So at its core, what's going on? You introduce shared ownership, you change the deal on the table. You treat people like owners because you want them to feel like owners. So whether it's a trust, whether it's a direct shareholding, what doesn't matter. You want people to feel like owners. So you share information, you share influence, you share reward. And why? Because you expect something in return. You expect people to act like owners. Most people don't have a blind clue what that means. Right. Most people have never been owners in a business. More and more people, younger employees, haven't owned a car or a house or a flat or anything yet because they haven't had the opportunity to do it. So you cannot afford to assume. So those FDs, the other bit that I say to them is, did you explain to anyone yet what you want? Have you told them what the ownership behaviors are day to day in role that you are expecting? What is it that you will look at? So not just the number that comes out at the end of your P&L. What is the thing that they can do differently, whether it's turning the light off when they leave the room or something more fundamental? I mean, look, I used to run a time and materials business, right? And we used to have this. We'd use platitudes, right? You've heard that, hope that everyone goes the extra mile, goes over and above. And right, you heard that like dozens of times, right? And always someone like a new consultant come in and we'd have, a day assigned to a task in a project, and they'd spend 2 days on it. And then you'd sit with them and you'd say, why did you spend 2 days on this? And they'd say, I was being an owner. I look at how much extra effort I put in. I went over and above for this client. And like, whoa, no, look, the owner behavior is produce the same output in half a day at the same quality. That's the owner behavior I'm looking for. Not, but people need guidance on that sometimes. And that, I'm insulting people because it's a simple example, but, there's a quid pro quo, but you have to guide people. Those behaviors you're asking for are going to be aligned to your business strategy. So there's just some really simple management science in this, which would activate this model in a really powerful way. And you asked me early on, kind of how do we scale these things and so on, right? And, that aha moment where you go, oh, this could be dramatic, could make real change. Well, I guess I had an aha moment for myself in the knowledge program, right? When for the first time, I was really forced myself to produce a theory of change, to basically go, okay, what is it that we think is the mechanics of what's going on here? And can we structure our assessment to test whether or not that's the case. And that's what we did. So we looked at the individual benefits, we looked at the company level benefits, and then we looked at the third level, which was the economy, society, community level benefits. And then we talked to those people running those businesses to understand what was going on in the black box that was driving those out. And where it was being done consciously, that's where you saw the compound impact taking place. You saw the business benefits significantly uplifting, and you saw the wider societal benefit uplifting accordingly. And it was because it was being done consciously. So my view, trade bodies and so on, the more we can start to promote that understanding of how important it is to get that good management practice in place. We get caught up in the governance, we get caught up in the mechanisms, we get caught up in the share prices and the evaluations and so on, and they are critical. But the biggest advert for this model is amazing businesses offering fantastic jobs with happy employees.
Wow. That so much was well stated in so many different ways. I have noticed in my time in employee ownership, there has been a great trend towards focusing on the culture of the business. And that fundamentally is what we're talking about. The culture, encompasses so much. When I started in 08 and 09, there really wasn't any conversation about culture at all in the transactions. And now any advisor worth their salt in the United States is stressing the importance of culture and introducing potential employee-owned companies to culture experts early in the process. And even so, part of what makes the task daunting, Campbell, and a lot of my data informally I get from the Owner to Owner podcast. That's the only mechanism in the US that I'm aware of, and perhaps elsewhere, where it's the entire point of that is an actual employee owner, Jesse Tyler, talking to actual rank and file employee owners. I tend to get the advocates and the C-suites on this podcast. And first, what comes to mind is that the consensus among the guests on the Owner to Owner podcast, and he's probably had almost 200 guests at this point among his 3 seasons, is that it takes 3 to 4 years to really get employee ownership, to really understand it. And this is at companies that have a pretty good EO culture. That when somebody comes in new, it takes some time because they've never come from that experience. And in the most recent episode of Owner to Owner, they pointed out they're often coming from jobs where there was some sort of traumatic experience, to come in and just not well run in toxic environments, and to come in and say, hey, this is different. It's going to take a little bit of time to put your guard down. But the other thing that struck me is that when we talk about the aha moments of the rank and file employee owners, there are buckets of categories that tend to show up. One of the aha moments makes all the sense in the world, and that is the first time I got my statement or when I became vested and really began to see the financial benefits, and I went, aha. And I celebrate those because, an ESOP in the US is actually, you strip away everything. It's a qualified retirement plan. So the fact that people are recognizing the environment or the economic benefits, I think is great. But the other thing, and this it just popped in my mind as you were speaking, is the second largest category is probably the folks who talk about their aha moment being related to the camaraderie they have with their employees, the togetherness, the belonging, the sense that we are all in this together, and that there's value in that, the shared mission. And I think that also needs to be nurtured by the company, by management, by the board of directors, and then implemented among the rank and file.
Yeah, no, look, I completely agree with that. There's a gentleman in the UK called Robert Oakeshott, who was a journalist and an advocate and a change maker, and he created what became our trade body for employee ownership in the UK, the Employee Ownership Association. He actually, 30 years ago, established the charity that many years later we kind of turned into Ownership at Work. And there's a lecture every year, the Robert Oakeshott lecture in the UK. And this year was a couple of months ago, and we had a guy called Matthew Taylor. Matthew Taylor he ran Tony Blair's policy unit in number 10, kind of 20 odd years ago. He's done a number of other things. He did a lot of work around what is called good work. He was commissioned by a Tory government to do a big project to establish what good work was. So I was fascinated to hear what he was going to say about this. And put very simply, and if Matthew ever hears this, please forgive me, Matthew, A, for stealing your very elegant argument, but also B, probably for murdering it. So apologies in advance. But he made this observation that, there are kind of three really core psychological drivers for most of us as human beings. We like to follow rules, right? Not all of us all of the time, obviously, right? But there is a part of us that likes to follow rules. There is a part of us that is motivated by, identity, by what, by the tribe we belong to, that we want to be seen to belong to. And there is a part of us which is just about individual kind of, well, this is what I want. This is what I want right now. It's in front of me, but generally, this is what I want. And he said, actually, you could take each of those and use them as the mechanism for bringing human beings together, right? And it happens at the level of countries, and you can imagine very rules-based autocratic societies versus very individualistic societies versus very communal, value-driven societies. But of course, it happens in organizations, all kinds of organizations. And to cut to the chase, he gave these fantastic examples. He made these observations that, so public sector organizations, for instance, typically very good at 2, but not 3 of them. So, very values driven, vocational, very good with a set of rules, often don't get that entrepreneurialism, that innovation, that individual, lever pull. Private sector organizations, very good at structuring the way that people get rewards to appeal to the individual, come with rules and governance, spend billions globally on trying to convince people of number 2, right? That they should be proud of their identity and where they belong to and so on. And a lot of it goes down the drain. And his just very simple, wonderful point was, you've got a model here which ticks all 3. You've got a model here which has governance and it has rules and it, and it brings some structures. It's geared to put reward and return into the hands of individuals in a way that feels fairer. You are unified around this thing that you belong to. You actually belong to it. You have a voice in it and you belong to it. That's an incredibly powerful combination. And I was just struck by that argument and how, as I said, how elegant I thought it was. And I think it's true at the level of how do you switch on individuals for this?
Ultimately, we are all in a chase for what is important, and the definition of that may vary a little bit, but your point is very well taken. Campbell, with an eye towards wrapping up, there are a couple of points that we want to close on before we go. And one of them is there seems to be great focus right now on the international aspect of employee ownership trusts. Do I have that right?
Well, look, you do, but I think what I would say is I think that the point you started at, Brett, so the international collaboration around the benefit, the impacts more broadly of sharing ownership in the workplace, I think that collaboration is powerful. I think I'm struck by how increasingly powerful it is each year. You're right that the EOT, is being picked up, right? So we know that they were lobbying for a long time, deciding what model they wanted to go with in Canada. I'm pretty sure they, quite late on in the process, but, deployed some of the knowledge program data to support the arguments they were making to get that commitment they now have to the tax relief applied to the EOT model in Canada. I know they've introduced the EOT model in Australia. I think Ireland had its first EOT last week. We know that there are EOTs now in the US. So again, there is no perfect model, right? And EOTs will work for some businesses and not for every business, just to be clear on that. But if it is a mechanism that is supporting the growing interest internationally and how do we make a larger proportion of our economies focused on this kind of reward model, this kind of motivation model, then to me, that's a good thing. But look, the thing that really gives me that faith that kind of international community is growing is there is this fantastic symposium event that's held in University of Oxford. It's been done for the last 2 years. It is led by the wonderful Graeme Nuttall, who you mentioned is, if you like, the author of the EOT in the UK. Supported, so there's another one this summer, supported by Jim Bonham, who you'll be familiar with as kind of the head of the EsOp Association in the UK. It's going to be kind of funded by the Employee Ownership Foundation from the UK largely. John Hoffmeyer as well, who I should mention, who helps run it with Graeme. And look, last year I think we had representatives from 20 countries, at that event. And it is, it's an invite-only event for kind of government officials and key advocates and stakeholders. But to have that sort of United Nations of employee ownership, if you like, coming together to say, what can we learn from one another? What can we see that's working, and starting to really bring the impact data into that mix as well. I mean, that it's hard. I mean, I know I'm a geek on this, so I'm an unapologetic geek on this topic. So if anyone's lasted this long, there'll be no doubt of that now. But like, to be in that room, that's powerful and exciting stuff, and it really gives you some faith in where kind of where developing and developed economies can go with this. So yeah, it's for letting me make that point.
No, I love that. And maybe we'll spend a little time on a mini cast closer to the event to talk about the symposium. And it is fascinating to just see how employee ownership is growing everywhere. Campbell, this has been for me invigorating. From geekiness spreads a lot of passion and a lot of great ideas. I am so grateful to the time that you have spent sharing your thoughts and educating us a little bit about the work of ownership at work and the work that you and your colleagues are doing. And I'm just so grateful that you have spent this time with me. So thank you so very much.
Thank you, Bret. Brilliant. I've loved it. Thank you for letting me get my soapbox. I'll get off it.
Oh, I absolutely loved it. And I want to give a final thanks once again to Daniel Goldstein for making the introduction. With that, we will wrap up this episode, this transatlantic episode of the EsOp podcast. My thanks again to Campbell McDonald of Ownership at Work. Check out the show notes for all kinds of links and relevant information. And thank you so much for listening. This is Bret Keisling. Be well.
We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Facebook at EO Podcast Network and on Twitter at EsOp Podcast. This podcast has been produced by Bret Keisling for the EO Podcast Network. Original music composed by Max Keisling. Branding and marketing by Bitsy Plus Design. And I'm Bitsy McCann.